So almost all South African media houses have at some point been accused of bias, whether covering a political scandal or even an issue that's grabbed the nation's attention, such as that Clicks racist advert this week. Some media groups have been dubbed tools of white monopoly capital, for example, or captured, depending on who is giving the review. So is the South African media biased, and is it time to own that bias as far as politics and other ideological positions are concerned, which inform our everyday choices as people who bring you the news? Would you support, for example, a media house declaring its leaning up front? Let's discuss this then with the chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum, Sbu Ngalwa, News 24 politics editor Qaanitah, and Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird. Afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us. William, I want to start with you and ask you the question of just how biased is the South African media?
Sure. Well, I mean, when we look at media reporting over an elections period, which is arguably one of the most sensitive and critical times when political bias is vital, we find that overwhelmingly South African media perform extremely well. You know, more than 95% of our media coverage in an election period is clearly fair and not biased. And that, I think, is a pretty incredible record for a democracy that is young like South Africa. Of course, it doesn't mean that there aren't any other biases built into that, because of course there are. You know, the nature of media is that they speak to certain audiences, they speak to certain people. You know, we don't see parity in women and men, for example. That, you could argue, is a particular bias. But if you're talking about political bias, then in an election period, the short answer is that overwhelmingly our media are not biased.
Qaanitah, you've been a reporter for a number of years now political editor at News 24. When you look at the reporting over the years, would you say that the South African public has been right in saying that the South African media is quite terribly biased?
I think it's a very big, misconception that there's this bias that exists, the biases that exist. And I think a lot of it has to do with the conflation of reporting with opinion pieces, for example. So there isn't a lot of media literacy. And so what happens as a result of that is that the public would conflate reflecting views that they may disagree with as being racist, for example, or slanted towards a particular agenda, whereas that is just opinion pieces. And so as a result, there is this narrative that is perpetuated, especially from our political, parties and political formations, that the media is biased. But the interesting thing is that everyone believes that. So there isn't any, the fingers pointing in one direction. It's more a sense of, if I disagree with you, I'm pointing towards political bias. I think that this can be solved with, number one, media literacy. And I think that when all political parties accuse a media house of some sort of bias, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing, because the DA would say you bias towards the ANC, and the ANC would say you bias to the EFF, for example. And so that is healthy in a democracy, I think, because it shows that you're not biased. And then this third point, Thembekile, is the issue of biases, not around political parties per se, but around particular arguments or factions, for example. And that's something we see, penetrate and find its way through in reporting sometimes, that we have to guard ourselves against.
South African National Editors Forum chairperson, you look at the reporting on politics in South Africa, right? And a lot of political reporters build relationships with politicians over years. Apart from that, we all come into these jobs with individual opinions and views on the state of the country, where it should go, etc. Is it then actually humanly possible, even at an editorial level, to say we can completely filter that out of our reporting?
Thank you, Thembekile. Look, it's not the reality is that we all have our own implicit biases, and I think that as the media, and as long as everyone understands that the idea of absolute objectivity is actually unattainable. But I think what is important is that is understanding those biases and owning those biases, and actually understanding the fact that All of us have our own biases that are determined by where we come from, by our own influences. But I think at any given time, though, what is always important is to try and to find a balance. And for me, I always say that it's important to be fair and balanced in our reporting. And secondly, the best way to minimize your bias is always to be guided by the journalistic principles and be able to tell that story and give the facts to the reader. Because, for instance, you would know that different media companies have their own missions. In terms of, for instance, let's say a story about the red ants. A story of the red ants demolishing shacks at an area where they have been built illegally. You can look at it two ways. Someone will come from a humane perspective, to say it's the middle of winter and these people are homeless. Another pro-market newsroom may say this is actually law enforcement and protection of capital interest. But the reality here is that I think the best way to deal with the biases is actually in the number of voices, having more media companies and coming out with their own biases. I don't believe that there is anything wrong with a company having either let's say a liberal left-leaning stance. And we've seen companies coming out like that. We've seen actually a New Age, which was pro-government, and there was nothing wrong with that.
But should that
it was clear and implicit.
Should that be declared up front? Because the issue a lot of news viewers and other consumers have, Sbu, is that we all claim to be neutral. We all claim that we've not taken a position.
Absolute neutrality, I don't think it's possible, as I say. But where you have a number of voices, media voices available, it is then able, I think the reviewer or the reader is able to discern that if they go to a particular news organization, they can be able to get the kind of stories that they're looking for, or they know the biases. Because one of the things is that all of us have political views, even as political reporters, but we don't talk about that. But all that is important is that, because that should not dictate how we approach our stories. As I'm saying, that the best way to minimize the bias is actually to be guided by journalistic standards, to make sure that at all given times you attempt to be fair and to give all sides of the story.
William Bird, let me come back to you, Media Monitoring Africa. So Christian Amanpour, the veteran CNN anchor, often speaks of being truthful but not neutral. Is that the way to do it?
Yeah, clearly, and I think that's what the other two speakers have tried to put across is precisely that kind of point, which is we acknowledge your biases, and you have to be conscious of them as a reporter, that you don't let that cloud your judgment. So if you go to report on political party A, and you think that political party A are a bunch of fruitcakes and they shouldn't even be in power or be having anywhere near close to power, you need to think about that and say, well, I need to make sure that when I report on this, I'm not clouding something that they're saying, because they may be making a very legitimate point. And that when you report that, you need to make sure that it's balanced, it's accurate, and it's fair. That's a very different thing from an editorial or an editor or a political reporter writing an opinion piece saying this is what I think is really going on in South African politics, and I think that these parties are doing dangerous things, etc., etc. And I think far too often there is that conflation between editorializing or making opinions on specific political issues and the actual news. As I've said, when we've done research on these things over the last 27 years, you'll see that our media, at critical moments, their news reporting is overwhelmingly fair, which is to say they aren't systematically negatively biasing the ANC or systematically negatively biasing the EFF or the DA. They tend to be very fair in the way that they cover them in an election period. Of course, we have seen some examples where they don't do that, and then it becomes very clear when you do see political bias like that. So people that often go and say, the media is biased, they do this, they do that, when you ask them for their actual evidence of it, it's very hard for them to produce it, because 9 times out of 10, there isn't the evidence for that.
Qaanitah, one could also argue then that perhaps people aren't able to prove that outright because there's more of an implicit bias versus the explicit. Is that where the issue is?
I think so, and I think that what Sbu is saying about, just being manifest about it is maybe perhaps helpful, because there are those implicit bias about being a pro-poor bias, for example, or being a pro-market bias, or a pro-capital bias that some organizations may have, and so spelling that out may not be, we are endorsing the ANC, for example, or we're endorsing the Freedom Front Plus, but it would be, helpful, at least for media literacy, for someone reading or consuming the news from a particular news organization to understand, some sort of leanings that media companies would have. I don't know if that would help. But I do think that implicit bias has nothing to do with fairness in reporting. And I think that if it does, then you're going to have a problem, because that's violating the press code. And I think that there has to be that distinction in terms of, when it comes to reportage, there's a set standard in terms of how to be fair, how to be accurate and truthful, and then there's the part where, for example, when the DA releases its policy conference resolutions on non-racialism, as a political editor, I can tap into my own views and opinions and my own biases, and then provide an analysis that people can agree or disagree with. And I think that the real test is to provide a multiplicity of voices, so that you're not only reading Qaanitah's views on the DA, but you're also reading Gwen and Gwenia's views at the same time. And that's how you're going to balance the fine line between the two.
You mentioned the key issue of policy, and after this breather, Sbu, I want us to pick up on the work that's happening at SANEF and adherence of things like the press code, for example. This is the News Grid Roundtable, our focus today on media bias. My guests, Sbu Ngalwa, chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum, News 24 politics editor Qaanitah, and Media Monitoring Africa's William Bird. We continue our chat after this. Don't go away.